very excited we'll have this time together. The competing panel right now, I think, has 5 panelists. And our goal is to show that it's about quality and not quantity. And I don't mean that to disparage any of my friends who are on the other panel, but to say, in thinking about structuring this panel, one of the things we really wanted to do was not have a large number of people giving snippets, but have sort of a very small but the right people actually be able to engage in a more intimate and substantive conversation about a topic which I think is important to everyone up here, but also important to everyone in the room. And I'll quickly introduce the panel just by saying, for those who heard Governor Granholm's remarks, she finished her remarks with this real, I think, passionate call to action, saying, BERC this is the group that should change the world. And basically go get them, all hands on deck. And it made me think back to 2005, 2006, when I was graduating from here as a PhD, go Bears. And I had basically been a PhD in engineering, had been working on a technology to change the world in solar, and was the type of individual, BERC was just barely about to be born as HERC. So for those who know some of the history, this was pre-BERC. But it was a time where I think the community of students and faculty at Berkeley were very, very gung-ho about exactly that message, that this is the community that should change the world in this area. And for me, that meant develop a technology which could disrupt the way solar power was done. The only way someone like me at the time could imagine changing the world with the technology was not to go become a professor at a university and not to go join one of the big corporations that I had, been recruited by. But it was obvious. It was go start a company, go raise a round of venture capital, scale, get a technology to scale, leverage market forces, and get it out into the world in a massive way. And had the opportunity to be involved in 2 venture-backed startup companies based on technologies, one in solar and one in batteries. And then spent the last 3.5 years as a program director at RPE. And basically that was about 10 years in total. And I think what we found over those 10 years was that the initial mentality that I had coming out of here of let's leverage the venture capital model to go change the world in a hard energy technology, materials, chemistry, hardware, big industrial markets, those stories didn't seem to pan out as the young entrepreneurs like me of the day thought they would. The ecosystem has shifted dramatically over the last 10 years. We have a situation where private capital for these very early stage ideas coming out of a university like this is nowhere near as aggressive in trying to support those things, largely because for any number of reasons, that mode did not seem to be as productive as we would have hoped in getting those technologies out into the world. Some of these are generalizations. And I think a lot of folks are kind of thinking about this question of, okay, what's the response? What's the new wave, the new model for early stage energy investing and commercialization? For me, there's only one element of that that's very important, which is for the folks sitting in this room who are saying, I'm going to stand up and sort of answer Governor Granholm's call to action and go change the world in this area, and specifically do so by developing technology that's going to get out there. What do you do? Where do you go? And at RPE, I saw a pretty disturbing trend over the last few years of folks who had the motivation, had the capacity to develop these types of solutions, and they really weren't sure what their path was. And so today, we're framing a conversation with, I think, 2 people who for me, represent exactly sort of the role models for the types of people who are inspired to affect change, specifically here at Berkeley. And I think we have two elements in the panel of these phenomenal panelists that embrace different aspects of some of the strengths that Berkeley has. Nancy, and I'll let them introduce themselves, but Nancy considered, one of, if not the leader in impact investing in the energy space, has been in this game investing in energy solutions, technologies, and otherwise for a number of years. But if you just look at the name of the firm, Double Bottom Line, very much a Berkeley concept. And then Doug, who has a very different, and I'll let him describe his sort of history and perspective, but comes from very much a hard science, sort of hard technology development background, first at DARPA, then as a traditional investor. And I'll take this opportunity to mention that both of our panelists in their respective venture capital careers were involved through their firms in investments in the biggest energy technology success we have, Tesla Motors. But now, Doug taking a different approach in terms of investing. So I'm just going to, with that framing, turn it over to Nancy and then Doug, and just hope maybe you can give an introduction based on that framing, and talk a little bit about what you see as the state of the ecosystem right now, specifically for folks in the room.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. And to the organizers, I'm sorry I got here just a little bit under the wire, had a parking snafu, so I hope I didn't cause any unrest, but I got here in time. So, but it's a pleasure to be back at BERC, and I'm always so inspired by the energy and the commitment and the optimism of people here. And so it's that kind of commitment that really keeps us going to work every day and making the decisions and fighting those tough battles. And so, before I was, Double Bottom Line, DBL, it means that we invest for both financial and social return. And now that our first fund is a 2004 vintage fund, so we've been doing this, can't believe it, for 10 years. And we used to have to defend ourselves and say, one doesn't diminish the other. And now, after doing it for 10 years, we can emphatically say that they enhance each other, those two returns. There's no other way to say that. And so we are firmly of the belief that investing to optimize your financial returns requires an understanding of where society is headed and what its social and environmental and socioeconomic needs are. So that's something that we're committed to, and I know many of the Cal students that I've had the privilege to work with over the years really do get that. But before I was a DBL professional, I was a traditional venture capitalist, and I would just say that, and I wasn't in energy because energy wasn't really an investable field. I did life science, I did tech, and some consumer, and it's a field that is full of failures, and so you have these dramatic successes in order to stay in the game. I mean, you have to, but it's not like you have a 100% track record. And so, and sometimes I think we're too hard on ourselves in the energy space, where we think that we're not as good as, we don't have the same kind of pop that some of the other sectors do. And I think we're beyond that. I think we've got some stellar companies, not just in energy, but of all the innovative companies over the past 10 years, I would say that Tesla is right up there, along with the names we're all familiar with, and Solar City as well. And now you're getting a whole new crop. While it's true that there are aspects of energy investing that make it somewhat perilous at times, especially when you get the politicization that we got several years ago, it's not that different from other sectors, and I think that's good news, because it means that you don't have this noose around your neck in terms of thinking that this is not going to work. You just have to be smarter and canny in terms of how you approach the non-technological aspects of what you do. And that's what we spend 90% of our time doing. I mean, the technology is super important, but the ecosystem, the policy, the people, the market respondents, the incumbents, all of that is so much more important. And so as we get into this dialogue, my view is that it isn't really the right approach necessarily to assume that coming out of school with a great technological background that you should automatically start a company. I mean, there are a lot of, for some of you, that's the absolute right decision, but there are a lot of ways to get to that point. I didn't start my own company till I was, in my 50s. So, I mean, everyone can do this at their own pace, and you learn a lot once you're out there in a company and learning, hopefully, from some of the folks that are the leaders of the industry. So, on that slightly controversial note, I'll be quiet for a few minutes.
So, from a rather different line, I did technology development right out of graduate school. I'm trained as a physicist/electrical engineer, materials engineer. Ran a business unit at a large government contracting company for 10 years, went into the lighting industry. So energy is not new in terms of startups. I think that's important for people to realize, is that aspects of energy have been part of the startup technology ecosystem, from materials and semiconductors and all kinds of aspects of that, for much longer than we've been talking about investing in energy. And we talk about clean energy, but let's understand that that's still energy investing. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. I come at it from the technology aspect. I also then, from the energy industry, from that lighting company, went to DARPA. And one of the things that I've come to focus on is, how do you take that breakthrough and how do you get it out into the marketplace? Not necessarily shooting for the $10 billion outcome, but where do you get the beachhead? Because oftentimes what you want to do and what you want to have is this seemingly very difficult combination of the incredible arrogance that folks from Berkeley and folks from my PhD alma mater, MIT, have in common, which is a good thing.
I didn't go to either of those schools, so.
Which is also a good thing. What you're trying to do is balance that with the humility that says you can get the horse out of the gate, but you're going to need partners to turn that into a cavalry run, which is going to be the finish line that you're looking for that really big impact. And the example that I give to people is, one of the first things I did, one of the reasons I left the lighting company I was in, which was doing an RF discharge lamp, is because I saw LEDs coming. And I tried to convince the rest of my partners in the company that I was in, I felt like Paul Revere, right? LEDs are coming, LEDs are coming. And they were all former GE folks, and they were like, right, that'll happen in 25 years like every other innovation in lighting. And I was convinced it was going to be a lot faster. So I bolted, went to DARPA, and kind of caused my foretelling to come to fruition, because the very first thing that I did was the LED flashlight. Yeah, right. The point here is that we didn't do LED lighting, right? The beachhead market was the LED flashlight. And the reason is because you had a very high pain point customer, the U.S. military overseas. We were sending a C-17 load of batteries a day to Iraq and Afghanistan. And we spent $40 million to put 600,000 flashlights in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they paid for themselves in 2 months. Okay? So part of what you need to do is you need to have that combination of hubris, that you can make the change, and humility, that biting off the tail of the elephant and letting other people help you with the rest is really a good thing to do. So you'll hear us talk about strategic partnerships. You'll hear us talk about beachhead markets. You'll hear us talk about time to market. those are all incredibly important things that you want to think about when you think about how this technology innovation that you're going to bring to the table is going to matter.
So I'd like to get back to Nancy's comment about, the advice to folks. I think we'll get back to that later. But the one sort of thread that I want to pull here on is, it made me think back, the startup we did in batteries, there used to be times late at night in the lab when my co-founders and I would literally turn to each other, and it's just when we were so exasperated, we would basically say, science is hard. Like that was that was sort of the mantra late at night. It's like whenever someone was doing something, you just turn and you go, science is hard. And I think I think we would all agree, kind of one of the things that came out of this push into the energy investment space, especially a lot of the hardware stuff, was this idea that so many things were coming out and they were early and the science was hard. And not just the science was hard, the technology was hard. And so I'm wondering from both perspectives, I mean, Nancy, you guys are still very active, finding phenomenal investments, seeing tremendous opportunities. And yet the numbers are pretty clear, which is that for the very early stage kind of harder technologies, the venture capital community certainly isn't funding to the same level or the same types of things that they were funding before. So tell us a little bit about the shift and what's the implication of kind of the science is hard realization on the pipeline that you see moving forward.
Sure. Well, I'll lead up to this, but the conclusion is that things are a lot better now than they were a few years ago in terms of early stage attention. And so, we did go through a difficult time in that post, 2009 to 2012 period where the whole clean energy effort got politicized, and we had the whole Solyndra issues, and so it was very difficult to finance, and there have been a lot of what we call tourists that came into the market and then kind of left when they saw how difficult it was, and so some of those numbers were inflated. It was kind of not a high quality group, and so now it's actually much better because the people that know how to do this are in it, and corporate investors and family offices are now much more active. So and international corporations are financing these companies with us. So the people, the players have changed. But now what you have, you've the whole politics has gone away, thank God. And you also had, I view the Solar City IPO in December 2012 as an inflection point, because before that it was impossible to take a company public except for Tesla in 2010. And now you've seen, you saw the Nest acquisition, you saw the inverter company, Enphase. You saw Vivint a couple of weeks ago. So there's now, while it's not, heavily populated, it's working. And so people are, and nothing satisfies venture capitalists more than seeing exits. And our food chain, our investors, the endowments, the pension funds, the foundations, they need to see exits. And so when there were no exits for several years, it's logical to think that people would say, okay, well, if I can't make money here, I have to feed my family, I have to go do something else. So that's kind of what happened. You didn't have enough exits because of some of the perturbations that happened in the market. So all of, as I started out by saying, I think the good news is that this is all behind us, and you have now, look at how many companies Solar City has acquired. Zep Solar, and they're hardware companies. They're not, they're not downstream players. They're back to basic scientific innovation. Made Zep Solar, made Solivo. I'm sure you're going to see other acquisitions by many of these players. I know SunEdison just invested in one of our companies. That's a tracker. It's a very innovative tracker technology. So it really is nonsense to say that people aren't investing in the hardware part of the business. It's now popular again. Why is that? Because we've gotten to a scale of growth and that we need to reduce costs. In order to continue that trajectory, and especially if we have problems renewing the investment tax credit, which is not a given. I don't like to say that at all. But we have to be smart. We have to continue to reduce costs so as to be able to get to a broader market. And so that's where technology comes in. You can't do that all with financing. You can do a lot. You can, the solar bond that came out a couple of days ago, that does reduce the cost of capital. I mean, that is an innovation, but you have to go back to performance of your product, and that has to do with what you all do here. So some of it is all timing. You kind of have to get to a certain point before technology, in terms of your market penetration and your growth, before you realize, hey, we can't approach the whole market if we don't, make those panels more efficient, or we don't use tracker systems, or X, Y, Z. But now we're there, and so I think, and you also have companies that can acquire new entrants. You have currency. It's not just Solar City. You'll see Vivint making purchases when some of these companies go public. Now they use their stock, and so that's a really good sign for everyone here as well. So I think that we lost definitely some momentum in that 2010 to 2012 period, and it delayed the gestation of some of these companies. Like some of our storage companies are just now, because the science is hard, doing their commercial pilots, and they get no credit for anything. I mean, it's like you can't, you don't have billion-dollar private valuations in this industry like you do in social media, but that's a good thing. I mean, in the end, all those bubbles always pop, and the companies that have survived are really able to make a valuable product. You can get it at a reasonable price, and then those are the kinds of foundational aspects that create great companies in the long run.
I think it's a great perspective, and I think what I've seen is a number of folks saying, well, this isn't. The space isn't the same if you're a technologist early stage that it was, and one of the comments that I would echo from Nancy is, yeah, you now, if you're in that position, have the benefit of having seen the last 5 to 10 years and learned and figured out, who are the strategic folks that are really engaged in the space in the right ways, versus folks who walked away. Doug, what do you kind of see out there?
I think, Nancy is pointing out the larger part of the market, and certainly the higher end of the market. Based on what we chose to do when I left Vantage Point, and like Nancy in my 50s went and started our own company, there's parallels here. We focused on the very small part of the market, the very early part of innovation, and really targeted acquisitions. And so I want to echo what Nancy's saying, that one of the ways that you measure the health of a market are the people who are in a position to acquiring companies. And the answer to that is yes. And that's a very healthy part of the market out there right now. But it's a very different way for an entrepreneur to think about it. We focus on very, very early stage companies that don't require a lot of money, that oftentimes can get a large chunk of that money from non-dilutive sources, ARPA-E, DARPA, other folks in the corporate sectors, but who can target having a product in the market, I'll come back to the LED flashlight, relatively quickly, that gets you to a reasonable business model that somebody else who's downstream of you, who's a much bigger fish, looks at that and says, that's a very interesting way for me to get into the market. Part of the learning that you go through when you're a technologist who's moving into business is one of these classic cost of capital discussions, which, the first time you go through it, you leave it feeling a little bit dirty. And then you realize it's perhaps the most important thing that you learned if you really wanted to get a piece of technology out there. And that is, how do you graduate through this laddered waterfall of being able to get to a point where somebody can then get money at a much cheaper interest rate, for lack of a better description, in order to grow your business? And the faster you can get to that point, the more valuable you are. And also from a technological perspective, the more relevant you are. One of the things I think our technology investor colleagues lost the bubble on in the 2000 timeframe is that technology markets shift relatively rapidly, or the foundation behind what you think you're doing for a technology market shifts relatively rapidly. So if you look, for instance, at the hardware in the cell phone industry, or if you look at the hardware assumptions behind some of the photovoltaic panel technologies, about every 5 to 10 years, with a mean of something on the order of perhaps on the longer edge, 7 or 8 years, the fundamental underpinning changes. In the early 2000s, silicon was expensive. By 2010, silicon was cheap. So if you formed a company in 1999 thinking that you were going to have expensive silicon, and you came to market in 2008, or you got to scale in 2008, and you didn't adapt, you were dead. If you went down the path of thinking that hydrogen was your friend in the 90s, and you didn't anticipate Tesla, you had a bad day. So speed, aggressiveness, and a little bit of humility combined with that arrogance, it's a real strong balancing point at the same point in time as, yeah, technology's hard every day.
I just have a story from to that point. I worked at Intel for 2 years before I went into venture clean tech or venture capital and investment banking, and I worked at Intel for Bob Noyce. I was just privileged to work for one of the co-founders. He passed away many years ago, but he was the inventor of the integrated circuit. And so I wrote speeches for him. I don't know quite how I got that job, but he addressed the IEEE one year. This was like in 81 or 82, and or 83, I think. And they wanted him to talk about the end of computing and that biological models were going to replace the electronic kind of semiconductor approach. And this was in the early 80s. And he was just such a funny guy, but he said, well, okay, let's come up with this, that, and the other. And we talked to all these brain people and mimicking, how the brain will become more important, the way it signals rather than semiconductors. But he said, but Nancy, probably 30 years from now, we'll still be saying the same thing and it still won't have happened yet. He was right, because we still have these conferences about the end of computing. So it is important to understand that you have to kind of, what your parents tell you, you have to walk before you run. You have to get something that has a tangible benefit without having to, change the universe.
Yeah. I think I'm trying to pick up on some of the things we're hearing. The idea of both Doug and Nancy talked about acquisitions. Who are the strategic folks who are really interested in the value you're creating in these things? Doug talked about the government. One of the things since leaving ARPA-E, I'm actually working on an initiative that's based here in Berkeley, out of the National Lab, geared towards supporting early stage hard energy technologies and getting them to the point where they can be viable. And when we think, at least around the thesis that we've built this around, is when thinking about what it means to get it to the point where it could be viable, you basically have to think very deeply about the question of, viable and valuable to whom. And, if I had to sum up at least my personal learning in thinking about, and it's not just energy, right? Hard technologies, industrial markets. For me, it's, this is, as Nancy said, it's a different play than a social media play. That's obvious. And in my mind, I think we have to think about this as a different asset class. And the question is, how do you support such an asset class, and what's the value related to the strategic interests of developing that value, the timescales. I think you just mentioned this 30-year, we'll be having the same conversation. And so, my view is there is a set of investors who are not able to invest in this asset class, and yet strategically, you heard from Governor Granholm, right? The government and society has a huge interest in creating new solutions for energy and technology rooted in R&D, rooted in science. The big corporations, whether it's the GEs or the new big corporations that Nancy's funded, the Solar Cities and the Teslas, are another very important kind of set of strategic interests. And so the question is, if you take the timeline and you take those strategic interests, both the government and industry, is there a way where we can create the framework? And what you realize is, if you don't talk about the traditional venture capital model or the traditional startup model, because you say, well, there is a traditional set of VCs that's moved to a different asset class or more suited to a different asset class, what you end up losing potentially is the vehicle of the startup, which I think we all agree is a very productive vehicle in terms of actually being aggressive, being quick, being nimble. And so, I'd love to get perspectives on what are ways to kind of align the different strategic interests around a new asset class here. If that's even the right way to frame it,
I'm not sure it's a different asset class because, I still see, I see differences between my non-clean tech investments and clean tech. I see a lot of similarities. So, and one of the things I always like to tell people, which people are like, what? But like Pandora is in our portfolio and Solar City, and they were kind of both growing at the same time. And no one else understands this because they didn't have them both in the portfolio. Those companies are very, very similar in terms of the bullets they've dodged, the role of personalization that is at the very core of the value proposition. Obviously, Pandora, personalized radio, but Solar City, what a lot of people don't understand, it's personalized energy. This is not your grandfather's electricity system where you don't even know where the power comes from. People don't even know where their meters are. You have no choice whatsoever in what you get. It's all going to be personalized. We're just in the early stages of that. And Solar had all these people gunning for it, and the ITC battle, but so did Pandora. All of the record labels were going after the royalty structure and tried to put that industry out of business. So they're not that dissimilar. It's just that it's always easier to have a consumer-facing company because it's just easier to understand. Yeah. And what's the good news is that the solar companies are becoming more consumer-facing. But back to your question about funding these new ideas, we have funds, and we're going to continue to have funds, and we're open for business. I mean, we do want to invest, not everything in early stage, but we definitely have that as part of our building block. And the difference is that now we're much pickier about our syndicates, and because that was really what broke a lot in that earlier period, was that people didn't, the tourists I mentioned, they didn't want to follow on, or corporate investors or whoever it was. A lot of syndicates weren't strong. So you have to, that means you have to spend a lot of effort getting a group together, be it strategics or international or family offices, as well as VCs, from the get-go, because then you have, and that you have to really make sure that they're committed to this and understand that it's going to be a long haul. But that is doable. I mean, we have examples of that. I would just say that, in my simple approach, to me, I'm much more comfortable listening to a pitch of an earlier stage technology deal if there's someone in that team that has actually worked somewhere outside of a university. I mean, it's just not, it's just, the real world is very different than what we love about universities. And so if you haven't crossed that particular chasm, there are a lot of things you don't know. And I don't mean to be dismissive in any way, but it's just, there's no substitute for kind of having gone through these near-death experiences in other companies.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear the similarity. I mean, the Pandora Solar City similarities. I think, I'm trying to think through this, but I think obviously Solar City is a technology company, but to some extent you'd say, well, built on the mainstream technology of the day, and I can imagine a lot of different business model issues coming up relative to something like Pandora. Can you kind of give some insights on some of the, because I think you have a reputation of having stuck with founders, especially through hard times, and so do you see a difference between sort of a Solar City and some of the companies you've invested in that really are changing the complete nature, from the basic technology, materials, et cetera? Or it's a spectrum, but
Well,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, a downstream player, your first advantage is not necessarily your technology, your business model. Software was a huge win in the early days, and now we've evolved beyond that. But in the more tech-dominated, certainly Tesla was all about the technology, and we had just a myriad of problems with that in the early days. But again, it had to do with the quality of the syndicate, and we had our issues. But when all was said and done, we had people that firmly believed that this was going to happen and that the leadership would make it happen. So
You had Elon Musk.
yeah, yeah. That helps. But we have other companies like
course, yeah.
my tracker company, Next Tracker. Dan Sugar, he was one of the founders of Powerlight, which we invested in. That was our first clean tech investment, which in 2006 or 7, I can't remember. But we sold. It was sold to SunPower, and that was a great early win before the downturn of 2008. So all was good. And then he went and started Solaria. Or he didn't start it. He became the CEO, which was a concentrated PV company that was doing extremely well. And he can sell anything. I don't know if you've ever met him, but he is just a force of nature in terms of his ability to persuade people to buy his products. But then the whole Chinese, bringing in under, pricing below their cost, that whole period was tough on all those players. And I always call him he's the postdoc of entrepreneurs, because what he did was very advanced and not for novices. He basically kind of gave up and said, okay, Solaria, we're going to sell most of you to the Chinese, because that was where our main customer base was. But we're going to transfer part of our owner. And I don't want to get into the sausage making, but anyway, we got a piece of our ownership into this tracker company, because he had been one of the inventors of the early inventors of trackers while at Powerlight, and he has just a better product. I don't know if any of you are going to SPI next week, the big solar show in Las Vegas, but you stop by at that booth, because it's an amazing product. But anyway, so we were able to transfer some of our ownership into Next Tracker, and we put in a little bit of money at a very low valuation. And we did it. Why? Because we trust him. He said, look, people need more efficiency on these ground-mounted systems. This is where it's we can eke out more percentage efficiency by just doing a tracker, which is cheap compared to all of some of these other advances. And sure enough, he just can't sell enough of this stuff. He is. I can't give you the specific number, but for the first full year of operations of this company, I've never seen anything like it. And he's got Sun Edison investing. And so he basically figured out, and now the original technology, back to our discussion a few minutes ago, the concentrated PV, now all of the big players are looking at that. And so we may have a double win in terms of we'll get something where we didn't think we'd get much out of Solaria, and then Next Tracker looks like it's going to be acquired eventually at a really big multiple. And so. And yet there were times when we thought, this was all going to be worth a big fat zero.
Yeah.
So, but that's why I say that's not for the novices. And he has great technology instincts, but his talents are more kind of the art of the deal, the relationships, and he has very, very strong technology people around him. And so that's why I say, it's just so important to build a team that is diverse in terms of its skill sets and experiential background.
Well, and it sounds like be creative in terms of how you're creating the value.
Yeah.
And where the opportunities
Yeah.
are. Doug, you're pretty far on one end of this spectrum to the extent that, what do you see from that end?
I think what Nancy describes as early, we would describe as mid to late. Just to
Well, we
put
have
the
some earlier ones too.
So we're a very small fund, and we have co-founded 4 of the 6 companies that are in our portfolio so far. We recognize, I think one of my colleagues is also a former DARPA program manager, IARPA office director, and so we recognized one of the things that we saw in the market was a lot of folks coming out of universities, a lot of folks that have been out and been entrepreneurs that didn't have the business expertise. And most importantly, didn't have that part of the expertise that took the notion to convert it into a prototype that would allow you to identify the business expertise that you needed to bring in to create the company that would follow. Folks like Dan are extremely rare. And that's one of the problems that our startup industry has, is that we left doing hardware for 15 to 20 years, and we didn't create a lot of hardware executives coming up through the chain. So as the senior hardware executives left, you have a paucity, a scarcity of folks that can step in and run these kinds of companies from the business perspective, like somebody like Dan. So you want to ask why CEOs and certain kinds of CEOs make a ton of money. Supply and demand. There's one, Elon Musk. And, there's a reason that folks like that are incredibly valuable. We've tried to plug that gap by looking at this flow of entrepreneurial ideas that are coming out of universities, national labs, folks that we did business with when we were at DARPA, IARPA, or formerly in business before that, and looking and cherry-picking those that we see an opportunity to turn into a product relatively quickly, or at least a prototype product, and then go out and hire somebody that might have been a game changer at an end phase, sees end phase now getting to a different stage, says, I'd like to do something else. So I think part of what both Nancy and I would tell you is there's room for new ideas across the spectrum of maturity. One of the learnings that I think is tremendously important is if you're at this institution, and most particularly if you're in this room, don't forget how many ideas a day, how many ideas a week you're going to have. Eat your young quickly, because what you cannot do is spend too much time thinking about an idea that isn't going to make the grade. Because by the very selection rules that the governor mentioned in her talk, yes, you've been chosen, you're one of those folks that's going to create. You can't help it. It's your lot in life. Deal with it. And one of the ways that you deal with it is by understanding that if it's not a great idea, if it's merely a good idea, move on. Because if you spend too much time working on a good idea, then you won't spend the time being open to the great idea that you'll have 10 days later. So be quick. Be fast. When you get your hooks into something, be committed. And understand, that's the same thing between the arrogance and the humility. You really have to almost be, that Jekyll and Hyde type of capability in your head to understand when you've got it and when you're going to ride that horse up the hill at Balaclava, or, it's dog don't hunt. Move on.
So I want to wrap up just the panel and open it up to questions. I think, the title of the panel, I think, had sort of shifting tides in it. For me, the take home, at least for now, that I would project to everyone is, to the extent that the tides are shifting or have shifted, I think see it as an opportunity. I mean, you're hearing from folks like Nancy. They're open for business. We have folks like Nancy who have seen now this movie play out, who can be much smarter in terms of how to fund, how to advise. The folks that Nancy has supported might be popping off of their last company, thinking time to do something new. And if they have the wisdom and the appetite to be in this space and be smart in this space, those are the opportunities to team up and have them be the folks who can help push your things forward. And then, I think we've got an example here through Doug in terms of the fund and the investment model that he's created, The work that I'm doing here in Berkeley, trying to support early innovations, there are probably 10 or 20 other nascent new models, new support structures that are out there across the country right now. So I think it's a very exciting time. And most importantly, the question is how do you capture the opportunity? So my last question for these two will be, other than waiting till you're in your 50s to start a company, which is apparently
recommending
the way to be successful, any kind of, for the folks here, if you were sitting in their shoes, how would you go about grabbing the opportunities right now?
Well, obviously, you don't have to wait that long. I mean, I was sort of a reluctant entrepreneur. I was very happy where I was. It just kind of didn't. Everything changed around me. But I guess my message is that it's a team. Your idea or your research, what you're doing, is incredibly important, and your role in turning it from an idea to reality is very important. But it just, you have to have a bench strength that goes beyond your expertise and your experience set. I mean, what I said at the beginning. So I would just highly recommend, and even if you have to delay a little bit in order to work with, a Dan Sugar or work at Tesla. I mean, just there are other, you can learn a lot by working in teams that are highly functional and that are, putting product out the door. And then either you can infuse your idea into that team. I mean, that certainly happens. Or if you really want to start your own thing, then, you can put a team around you that is more that complements your own expertise. But I just, we see so many proposals that unless there's something that distinguishes you from the next brilliant person you're sitting next to, it's kind of hard to get the attention that you deserve. So a lot of it is in taking a more holistic approach to seeing your idea become reality.
I think a very similar outlook. The advice that I have given to any number of the young folks that I've already met through Ilan's program, have a 10-year view, and constantly be in a position of asking yourself, what is it that I want to be able to do 10 years from now, and how do I acquire the skills, the expertise, and the experience, and particularly the experience, because there is no teacher quite like experience, in order to position yourself to follow the kinds of things that you want to do. If you see the opportunity early to link up with the right kind of team, grab it, run with it. Teams are tremendously important. If you get the opportunity to work with an Ilan or with a Dan Sugar, or I could go down a list, it's not really very long, take it. But take it with the idea that you're there to learn something. And like Nancy had the opportunity to work with one of the founders of Intel, realize that you have an opportunity to learn and make the most of that learning experience and use that as a springboard to what you're going to do next. Don't ever be satisfied. That's perhaps the most important thing as you have that 10-year plan. Realize that you have a gift. By definition, if you're in this room, you have that gift. And mimicking the same statement that was made downstairs earlier, that means from the social responsibility perspective, you have an obligation to apply that gift to the betterment of society and the people that are around you. And there's a team of folks. I think all three of us up here would be sitting here very happy to give you advice, which you may or may not want to listen to. And I think you really want to think about how you can be what you can be 10 years from now. Today is a very difficult challenge, but 10 years from now, you can put a plan together to go after it.
Can I just say one thing?
Of course.
I don't want to set the bar too high. I mean, there are only so many Elon Musk and Dan Sugars of the world, but you don't have to have your team have those people. I mean, there are so many great folks at the middle level of these companies. And who knows? Someone in this room may be the next Elon Musk someday. But it's more getting the diversity of talent, approach, perspective, and quality people than having to be with one of the rock stars.
Questions, ideas, thoughts?
So
Wow.
we're going to do a question from the
Okay.
app first, and then we'll come around to everyone. So there's a lot of great discussion on funding asset-based companies. What are your thoughts on the trends of service-based companies? They have faster to market benefits, but not clear on what the market trends have been after companies like Enernoc and O-Power have been so successful. Thoughts?
I think that one's for Nancy.
Well, I think that certainly service-based companies have been successful, but I think what you're seeing now, and I think you're going to see it in energy efficiency as well, there's only so far you can go with a service. I mean, you have to infuse more either cost effectiveness or high performance, better performance into a service in order to stay ahead. So I think there are some platform companies out there, but and you see SolarCity is going upstream. It's investing in technology, it's as well as the financing. I would think that O-Power will eventually acquire some of these, maybe some of the systems that disaggregate some of the power usage by device. I mean, because there's only so far you can go, I think, on kind of behavioral approaches.
Other questions? We had a few over here.
So, I'm an assembly member in California. I'm from Hayward. I would like to see the state use its cap and trade money to develop technologies, but the legislature is not a good place to pick winners and losers. I don't see a way of. I don't know that we have the bureaucrats to do it. If we were to try and invest cap and trade money, how would we go about this? And if you can't answer the question now, think about it and get back to me later. But it's a very tough question. There's billions of dollars out there. Right now, a lot of it's going to fund a train. And I would like to see it developing technologies.
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion that we could talk about for hours, but it is not, I mean, we have been funding in California technologies. Powerlight, in its early days, received grants from the California Energy Commission that were pivotal to its growth. And we say this all the time to the people in Sacramento. You guys have already played a role in making California the leader in clean tech. And those funds are still available. I mean, I think all of you in the EPIC program we live in a great state in terms of access to funding. The idea of using the cap and trade dollars to enhance that and even go deeper is that's certainly something worth discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just having been at RPE, where not at the state level but at the federal level, I think Congress said we need a vehicle to invest in technologies, especially earlier ones that can move the needle in the energy space. I think what I would say right now, I would agree with Nancy. In California, right, relative to other states, tremendous amount of funding for technologies in this space.
I mean, we got Tesla and SolarCity and Cal, or was it the lab? Back in 2008, I think we got a CEC grant to look at batteries.
Distributed storage, yeah.
Yeah, and car batteries in distributed storage.
One of the things that I would comment on relative to this discussion is if what we really think the value is here is not in any technology idea. I will tell you there are thousands of phenomenal ideas across the country that we saw at RPE. The value that I think we have in this space, in this state, in this room, is the human capital, right? Like Doug said, the folks who have not just the capacity, not just the brains, but the motivation to go do something in a different mode and throw their life into it. Those are the folks who I think were starting very early stage companies over the last 10 years. And what I've found is the best way to support that as an impact is, let's figure out how to create a home for those people, where it's not that they have to spend, a year and a half, 2 years trying to raise private sector funds for something that's very early. Let's find a way to give entrepreneurial technology innovators the atmosphere, the capabilities, and the resources to actually make progress. And so for us, in this M37 project we're working on, it's about capturing those people, giving them an opportunity that falls outside of the normal R&D kind of career tracks, academia, industry, and then linking them to the phenomenal resource bases we have here in the state, which is the universities and the national labs. The tools and expertise that you have in a place like this are exactly what you need to develop energy technologies. You need tools to support science. You need interdisciplinary experts to support science. And so how can we further leverage that, I think, in support of these people and ideas?
I mean, I think Nancy's right. If you wanted to go down that path, we could have a long discussion. There's two observations that I would give from 8 years and well over $1 billion worth of experience at DARPA. And one of the reasons that DARPA is so tremendously successful at what it does is it satisfies both push and pull, or if you want to think of it the other way around, carrot and stick. And to the extent that the political willpower in California is willing to satisfy providing both a foundation for the rapid and well-conceived formation of startups, as well as providing the clear signal in terms of where the desired product streams are needed in order to satisfy social-based requirements, that then sends a signal to everybody of start here, finish there, you can get to there, and now the folks that have the ability to put out bonds at 8% can now buy you and scale you up. That has both the local benefit as well as the macro benefit that I think all of us understand needs to happen. And there are other types of transitions in that space. There's a variety of different ways to fund these kinds of models. But it requires, you can't just do push, you can't just give grants, because that will end up with little isolated camps of technology development that don't have a home and don't have anywhere to go. And there will be a lot of money spent to not really great effect. And if you generate a lot of pull, then that will have great societal effect, but you will end up creating a lot of jobs elsewhere as well, which is not a bad thing if you want to take a more global look to it. But there's a balancing act that you want to strike there.
Let's get a couple more questions. I think we've got another 5-10 minutes or so.
We actually are out of time, so one more.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For which I get a microphone. Hi, I'm Bud Beebe. I'm with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Utilities are changing rapidly. I've seen a lot of new tech come through me. I work in ER&D stuff. I was in photovoltaics in the 80s, that sort of thing. So the difficulty often is finding the right horse that you think the cavalry will go with, if you will, to use your analogies. How do you find, what are some guideposts for people to decide the right horse?
You're going to put, again, I'm going to use a lot of language and data from DARPA because there's so much data to come around and it's been such a successful organization. One of the things that they like to say is that 90% of their bets fail, but 90% of their dollars succeed. And the reason behind that is they make a lot of early, fast bets. They're called seedlings. You're very familiar with this, Ilan, from your time at RPE. You'll see sometimes these programs come out and it's a $150 million program to make the next Wumpty-Schmibbit. What you don't realize is that there have been, a dozen $500,000, $250,000, $750,000 efforts that led up to that, of which a dozen minus one all got shot. And The reason is because what you're doing is you're putting out some very directed seed capital, and you're positioned to be able to harvest. And that's what I mean by both push and pull. And DARPA does both of those things internally. And good financial programs that fund R&D to create products understand that you need to be able to do both. And so, to use the LED flashlight analogy again, DARPA had spent a huge amount of money over time developing LED technology alongside the commercial folks. But it had been, at universities and pieces along those lines, it was relatively spread out. It got to the point that it was ready to be harvested, and we deployed a large chunk of money to get it into the field almost immediately. Push and pull. And when you can pull those kinds of things, you realize that you can pick the horse that's moving out in front. You don't have to pick the horse in the Kentucky Derby when it's still in the gate. You can wait till it's at the mile pole. And that's what you try to do.
Yeah, I think my quick perspective there would be have your horse be the problem statement, not the solution. Right? I mean, we talk about RPE as a portfolio of portfolios. The one thing we know we have to get right is framing a problem statement that's meaningful. You can't predict which of the solutions is going to win. Maybe with time you can see whether they're going to succeed and fail based on the data that comes out of them. You can think about the people, but what you don't want to get wrong is the problem statement.
And I would just say it's important to look at what is being funded by the private sector because, a lot of times everything's aligned, but sometimes I see, utilities invest, work with some company that doesn't have any kind of a capital structure that's going to be there around for the long haul just because they like the technology. And so, again, this is the theme. If the company isn't strong, if it doesn't have the team and the backing to go through the various stages of evolution, just because you like it is not going to make it viable as a company. So I think more communication between, and same goes for us. We should be paying more attention to what you like because obviously you're a customer. And so that bodes well for the success of a product. So more two-way conversations, I think, are helpful.
The buzzword we used was to be outcome-focused and approach-agnostic. So I think that's the same kind of statement you're getting from all three of us.
It's not bad as startup advice either. I think we'll close it there. Please join me in thanking Doug and Nancy. I know Nancy has to take off, but I think Doug will be here for a little bit.